He pressed his dead wife's ring into her hand, then walked into a hail of gunfire to buy her life with his own. A lone woman came to the unforgiving West, carrying her dead father's map. She wasn't seeking gold, but a sacred promise. But in a land that never forgives, she was hunted by ruthless enemies. Her only hope for survival was a giant of a man, a ghost haunted by a grief as vast and as deadly as the desert itself. Theirs was a story of survival, of vengeance, and of a bond forged in desperation. A bond so powerful that in the end he pressed his dead wife's ring into her hand, then walked into a hail of gunfire to buy her life with his own. The Dragoon Mountains didn't suffer fools, and the August sun was its chief executioner. It beat down on the lone figure of Eleanor Vance, bleaching the red rock to a pale, ghostly white. A woman from Boston had no business being here, where the land itself was an adversary. But Ellie was not just a woman from Boston. She was the daughter of Professor Alistair Vance, and this unforgiving land held the last piece of his legacy. Wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a worn leather glove, she consulted the map again, not the pristine document she'd started with, but a creased and sweat-stained companion. Her work was not for gold, but for life. Deep beneath these scorched escarpments, her father's research promised a network of aquifers, a hidden water source that could turn this desperate, thirsty territory into a place where families could plant roots. For 3 weeks, she had followed his final cryptic notes, her pack mule, Clementine, her only confidant. Now, standing before a distinct granite outcropping, shaped like a hawk's head, her heart hammered against her ribs. There, etched into the stone at its base, was the symbol he'd told her to look for. A simple compass rose, but with a single, tiny star carved into its northern point. His mark. A lump formed in her throat. She traced the carving with a trembling finger, the rock still holding the day's oppressive heat. "Just as you described it, Papa," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "I'm close." Unfurling the master map, she began to make the final triangulations, her geologist's mind finding solace in the familiar comfort of angles and elevations. This map was his life's work, and now it was her promise. But as the sun bled out across the horizon, the canyons filled with shadows, and the familiar landscape turned alien. A sudden chill, having nothing to do with the dropping temperature, slithered down her spine. The silence of the desert was rarely absolute. There was always the buzz of an insect, the skitter of a lizard, but now the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Ellie felt it before she saw it, the primal, unnerving sensation of being watched. Slowly, she lifted her gaze from the map. High above on the canyon rim, a figure stood, stark and unmoving against the bruised purple sky. It was too far to see a face, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A lone Apache warrior, a longbow held loosely in one hand. He wasn't moving, he was just watching. And in that silent, patient gaze, Ellie Vance understood that the sun was no longer the most dangerous thing in the Dragoon Mountains. It began not with a war cry, but with a silence that was torn apart. A sound like a hawk's screech echoed from the cliffs, answered by another from the opposite wall. Before Ellie could process the signal, the rocks themselves seemed to give birth to warriors. They poured down the scree slopes, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace, a whirlwind of buckskin and dark, focused eyes. There were 5 of them, led by a man whose face seemed carved from the same unforgiving rock as the mountains. He was Iron Vulture, and his gaze was fixed on the leather-bound chest containing her father's life work. Ellie's hand instinctively went to the small revolver at her hip, a weapon she'd barely learned how to use. She fired a single shot, the sound pathetically small in the vast canyon, before a warrior wrenched the gun from her grasp. Chaos erupted. Clementine screamed in terror and bolted, disappearing into the twilight. Another warrior kicked over her small campfire, scattering embers onto her canvas tent, which caught fire with an hungry whoosh. Ellie scrambled for the map chest, her only thought to protect her father's promise. She clutched it to her chest, but a warrior grabbed it, the two of them locked in a desperate tug of war. The man was stronger, but Ellie's desperation gave her a wild strength. As they struggled, another warrior kicked at her, his moccasin striking the chest with a sickening thud. The lock burst, and the heavy case flew from her hands, tumbling end over end into the deep black chasm beside them. The struggle ended as quickly as it began. A sharp blow to her shoulder sent her sprawling to the ground, the impact stealing the air from her lungs. The warriors stood over her, their task complete. Iron Vulture walked to the edge of the ravine, peering into the darkness where the chest had vanished. He turned back, his eyes like chips of obsidian finding a single piece of parchment that had fluttered free, a corner of a topographical chart. He picked it up, his expression a mask of cold fury. He knelt beside Ellie, forcing her to look at him. His English was broken, but his meaning was clear as a rattlesnake's warning. "Sacred ground," he hissed, shaking the scrap of paper. "This land, no forgive trespassers." Then, as one, they were gone. They melted back into the shadows they had come from, leaving behind only the crackle of the burning tent and the smell of ozone. Ellie pushed herself up, her shoulder screaming in protest, a trickle of blood matting the hair at her temple. She crawled to the edge of the chasm, her cries echoing into the abyss. The maps, her supplies, her mule, her promise, all of it was gone. The desert had rendered its judgment, and the sentence was death. As darkness consumed the last of the light, Eleanor Vance was utterly and completely alone. Consciousness was a cruel visitor, returning in brief, agonizing flashes. First came the cold, a deep, invasive chill that seeped into her bones from the stone beneath her. Then came the pain, a throbbing symphony in her head and shoulder. Above, the indifferent stars glittered in a black velvet sky. Thirst was a physical presence, a fist clenching in her throat. "This is how it ends," she thought. Not in a warm Boston bed, but as a nameless casualty of the Arizona desert. As her eyes drifted shut, she prayed it would be quick. A shadow blotted out the stars. At first, she thought it was an animal, a bear perhaps, drawn by the scent of blood. But this shape was wrong. It was too tall, too broad. It was not a beast, but a man, though of a size that defied belief. He moved with a silence that was more terrifying than a thunderous approach, a ghost gliding over the rocks. He knelt beside her, and Ellie got her first clear look at him. He was a wall of buckskin and beard, his face a landscape of harsh lines and old sorrows, framed by a mane of untamed iron-gray hair. His eyes, barely visible in the starlight, held no warmth, only a weary assessment. He looked at her not with pity, but with the detached interest of a man examining a broken wagon wheel. Without a word, he set to work. His hands, the size of desert tortoises, were surprisingly deft. He cleaned the gash on her forehead with a damp cloth that smelled of sage, then applied a dark herbal poultice that stung with a clean, sharp fire. He gave her water from a battered canteen, a few sips at first, then more. The liquid was the most glorious thing she had ever tasted. He produced a strip of jerky so tough it made her jaw ache, but the salt and protein sent a jolt of life through her exhausted body. He did all this in an unnerving, profound silence, the only sound a low grunt of effort. When he was done, he stood up, the movement economical and final. He slung a rifle over his massive shoulder and turned to leave, melting back into the darkness from which he came. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through Ellie's delirium. "Wait," she croaked, the word tearing at her raw throat. "Please, don't leave me." He didn't stop, didn't even slow down. It was just a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He wanted no part of her. With the last of her strength, Ellie crawled forward, her fingers snagging the worn fringe on his leather legging. He stopped, his back still to her, a monolith of indifference. Tears and dust streaked her face as she looked up at his immense form. "I made a promise," she gasped, the words tumbling out in a desperate plea. "To my father. I can't die here. I made a promise." The giant of a man went utterly still. His massive shoulders tensed, and for a long moment he did not move, did not breathe. The cold desert wind swirled around them, carrying the weight of that one single word. He turned, and in the starlight, his expression was not one of pity, but of grim resignation, as if he were surrendering to a fate he had long tried to outrun. He said nothing. He simply bent down, and with an ease that defied his size, scooped Ellie into his arms as if she weighed nothing more than a child. The world became a dizzying blur of rock and sky as he carried her, his stride sure-footed and powerful. She lost consciousness in the steady, rhythmic cradle of his arms, succumbing to the safety she had been so brutally denied. She awoke in a cave. It was less a home than a den, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something else, a deep, lingering solitude. A small fire crackled in a ring of stones, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Her bed was a pallet of soft furs, and a clean bandage was wrapped around her shoulder. The giant of a man, who she now knew was named Caleb, sat by the fire, sharpening a large hunting knife with methodical, deliberate strokes. He ignored her stirring, his silence as heavy and solid as the granite walls around them. The days that followed were a silent, unspoken truce. Caleb would leave at dawn and return with game or edible roots. He taught her, not through words, but through terse gestures, how to track the sun, which berries were safe, how to set a simple snare. In return, Ellie tended to the camp and, one evening, to him. While he slept, she saw the network of old scars that crisscrossed his back and arms, the telltale mottling of a severe burn. Using the last of the salves from her own medical kit, she gently cleaned and dressed the worst of them. He never acknowledged her actions, but she knew he was aware of them. They were two wounded animals, circling each other in a fragile alliance, communicating through actions because words were too dangerous. The breakthrough came with a scream. On the third night, Ellie was jolted awake by a sound from Caleb, a strangled, guttural cry of pure agony that clawed its way out of his sleep. "Sarah!" The name was a raw wound. "Lily!" "No!" He thrashed on his furs, his powerful body caught in the grip of a nightmare far more terrifying than any Apache raid. Ellie's blood ran cold. The names hung in the air, echoes of an unspeakable loss. She knew then that his silence was not born of callousness, but of a pain so immense it had consumed his voice. She did not wake him. Instead, she brewed a tea from the calming herbs he had gathered and left the steaming cup on a rock beside him. The next morning, the air in the cave was thick with unspoken things. Caleb was awake before her, staring into the fire, the empty cup beside him. He finally looked at her, his eyes holding a flicker of something she couldn't name. "The ravine, where your chest fell," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, unused to speech. "I will take you there." Hope surged in Ellie's chest, but he extinguished it with his next words. "When it's done, you leave these mountains, you go back east, and you never look back." An alliance was forged, not of friendship, but of shared wounds, and a promise that had to be kept. The journey to the ravine began at dawn. The terrain was a brutal conversation between stone and sky, and Caleb moved through it like a native language he had spoken his entire life. He read the bent grass, the disturbed pebbles, the direction of the wind, his eyes constantly scanning, listening to secrets Ellie couldn't hear. She followed in his massive footsteps, her initial fear of him slowly being replaced by a grudging respect. He was not just a giant. He was a guardian of this harsh world, and for now, she was under his protection. Danger came as swiftly as a hawk's shadow. They were crossing a dry wash when Caleb suddenly stopped, his head cocked. He sniffed the air. "Smells like rain," he grunted, though the sky above was a flawless, searing blue. He pointed to a high ledge on the canyon wall. "Up, now." Ellie didn't question him. They scrambled up the rock face, and not a moment too soon. A low rumble grew into a deafening roar as a wall of churning muddy water, a flash flood, thundered down the wash, a liquid brown monster devouring everything in its path. They watched from their perch, the raw power of the desert on full display. The next day, it was a threat of a different kind. As Ellie navigated a narrow, sun-drenched pass, a dry, papery buzz erupted from the rocks beside her foot. She froze, her blood turning to ice. A diamondback rattlesnake, coiled and ready to strike, lay less than a yard away. "Don't move." Caleb's voice was a low, steady command from behind her. Before she could draw a breath to scream, there was a blur of motion. Caleb's knife, drawn from its sheath with impossible speed, flashed through the air and pinned the snake's head to the ground with a sickening thud. That night, a violent thunderstorm forced them into the shelter of a shallow overhang. As rain lashed down outside, they sat in silence, the firelight casting flickering patterns on the stone. To fill the quiet, Ellie spoke of her father, of his gentle wisdom, and his unshakable belief that this land held more life than death. "He saw this place not as something to be conquered," she said softly, "but as a puzzle to be understood. He believed this land didn't have to be an enemy." Caleb stared into the flames, his face a mask of shadow and light, listening. For a long time, the only sound was the storm. Then his voice, barely a whisper, cut through the noise. "My wife, Sarah. She liked the stars too." It was the first time he had offered a piece of his past freely, a tiny key turning in a long, rusted lock. The silence that followed his mention of Sarah was different. It was not empty, but filled with the presence of a ghost. They finished their meager meal of roasted snake, the quiet broken only by the crackle of the fire. The flames cast a warm glow on Caleb's arms, illuminating the silvery, puckered skin of his old burns. Ellie knew it was a violation to ask, to pick at a wound so obviously deep, but she also knew that some wounds fester in the dark. "Caleb," she began, her voice soft enough that he could pretend not to hear. "The burns. Was it in a fire?" He went still, his hands frozen around the knife he was cleaning. For a full minute he did not move, staring into the embers as if seeing a scene only he could witness. When he finally spoke, it was with a voice she had never heard before, hollowed out by grief, scraped raw by memory. "Her name was Sarah," he said, not looking at her. "She was a teacher from Pennsylvania. Came out here with a heart full of books and Bible verses. Lord knows why she chose a rough man like me." A sad ghost of a smile touched his lips. "And we had a daughter, Lily. Hair the color of corn silk and a spirit so bright it could have lit up this whole canyon." He paused, gathering the strength to continue. "We had a good piece of land, down in the flat valley, good water. I built our cabin with my own 2 hands. He looked down at those hands, flexing them as if remembering the feel of the axe. Too good, it turned out. Men came, saying they were prospectors, said the land was worth more for what was under it than what was on it. They wanted me to sell. I told them to go to hell." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "I was away, hunting, up in the high country, gone 3 days. When I was riding back, I saw the smoke. By the time I got there—" He choked on the words, his massive frame shuddering with a silent sob. The cabin was an inferno. They'd barred the door from the outside. I tried to get in. The heat. It was like the gates of hell had opened right there. I could hear them screaming my name. His voice broke completely. "And then I couldn't." He fell silent, the firelight reflecting in the unshed tears that glistened in his eyes. He held up his scarred arms. "This is all I have left of them, a reminder that I failed." Ellie felt her own tears tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. After a long moment, Caleb's voice returned, now flat and cold as river stone. "They weren't just prospectors. They were hired guns. They worked for a man who wanted that water, who wanted that land, a man named Silas Blackwood. The name fell into the silence like a stone into a deep, dark well. He owns the big silver mine in the next valley, owns the sheriff, owns the judge. He got my land, and he got away with murder. The ghost of the mountain had a name for his demon. And suddenly, Ellie knew her journey was no longer just about a map. The confession left a heavy silence between them, a shared space of grief that followed them through the canyons for the next 2 days. They were running low on supplies, and the water in Caleb's canteen was nearly gone. It was late afternoon when Caleb stopped, holding up a hand. From a valley below, a thin white ribbon of smoke curled into the sky. Caleb's posture went rigid with caution, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle. He moved toward it with the silence of a predator, motioning for Ellie to stay behind. After a long moment, he gave a low whistle, the signal for all clear. When Ellie reached the camp, she found a small clearing by a gurgling river. An old man with a beard like spun silver and a face mapped with 1,000 friendly wrinkles was tending to a pot over a fire. He seemed as old and weathered as the landscape itself, but his blue eyes held a lively twinkle. He looked from the giant, silent man to Ellie, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice a warm, friendly rasp. "You got your father's eyes. You must be Alistair Vance's girl." The man was Jedediah, a prospector who had known her father for years. Within minutes, Ellie was holding a tin cup of the best coffee she had ever tasted, while the smell of frying bacon filled the air. Jedediah treated Caleb with a familiar respect, calling him Bear and asking no questions. For the first time in weeks, Ellie felt a profound sense of peace. Here was a small island of kindness in a vast, violent ocean. Jedediah shared stories of prospecting with her father, his words painting a picture of the man she had idolized. As night fell, Ellie told him of the Apache attack. Jedediah's friendly expression hardened. "Iron Vulture," he spat the name like a curse. "That one's bad medicine. He and his renegades. They ain't following the old ways." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Funny thing, though. For a band of outcasts, they're flush with new rifles. Brand new Winchesters, the kind a man can only get from one place round here." He paused for effect, letting his words sink in. Silas Blackwood's company store. Ellie and Caleb exchanged a look, a sudden cold understanding passing between them. Jedediah continued, connecting the dots of a conspiracy he had pieced together from whispers on the trail. "Blackwood wants this whole territory. He uses Iron Vulture to stir up trouble, to burn, and to raid. The settlers get scared, sell their land for pennies on the dollar, and who do you think is there to buy it all up?" He shook his head, his expression grim. "That ain't a map you're carrying, girl. It's the motive for a war." Suddenly, the map in Ellie's mind shifted. It was no longer a simple chart of rock and water, but a web of greed and violence. And she and Caleb were standing right in the center of it. Jedediah's words hung in the air, heavier than the gathering night. Before anyone could speak, a sound cut through the gentle murmur of the river. Not the snap of a twig, but the cold, metallic click of a rifle hammer being pulled back. Caleb was moving before the sound finished, reacting with an instinct born of old wars and fresh grief. He lunged, shoving Ellie to the ground behind a thick log, just as the night erupted in a deafening barrage of gunfire. Splinters flew from their cover. These were not Apache arrows. This was the methodical, repeating thunder of professional killers. "Blackwood sends his regards," a voice snarled from the darkness across the river. That was all it took. The name acted as a key, unlocking a cage of pure, primal fury inside of Caleb. He let out a roar, not a sound of fear or pain, but of a decade of suppressed rage finally given voice. It was the sound of the mountain itself breaking apart. He was no longer a silent ghost. He was a vengeful spirit. Moving with a speed and ferocity that seemed impossible for a man his size, he returned fire with his powerful rifle, his shots precise and devastating. Ellie, pinned down, watched in terrified awe. This was the bear, unleashed. When two of the gunmen tried to cross the river to flank them, Caleb abandoned the rifle. Drawing his massive hunting knife, he met them in the shallows, a giant specter of vengeance against the moonlight. The fight was brutal, intimate, and mercifully short. He moved through them not like a man, but like an avalanche. The last gunman, seeing his companions fall, tried to flee back into the darkness. Caleb raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The man fell. Silence returned, thick and suffocating, laced with the acrid smell of gunpowder. But as the echoes faded, another sound took their place, a soft, wet cough. Ellie turned. Jedediah was leaning against a saddle, his hand pressed to his chest, a dark stain blossoming between his fingers. He'd been hit by a stray shot in the first volley. "Jed!" Ellie scrambled to his side, her medical training taking over. But one look told her the wound was fatal. Caleb rushed over, the rage draining from his face to be replaced by a familiar hollow agony. He had won the battle, but death had still found its way into their camp. Jedediah looked up at them, his breath coming in shallow rasps. Don't let him win, Ellie," he wheezed, his eyes pleading. He pushed a small, oilskin-wrapped package into her hand. It was heavy, cylindrical, dynamite. "Your pa, he wanted to build, not destroy. Use this to protect it." His eyes found Caleb's. "Protect the girl, Bear." Then a final shuddering breath escaped his lips, and the friendly light in his eyes went out forever. They sat there in the sudden, terrible quiet, the bodies of their enemies lying in the shadows. The small island of kindness had been swallowed by the ocean of violence. Now they were no longer just running, they were hunting. They buried Jedediah by the river, under the shade of a lone cottonwood tree, marking his grave with a simple cross made from scavenged lumber. Caleb carved the old man's name into the wood with his knife. They stood there for a long moment, two solitary figures sharing a grief that needed no words. The loss had cemented their alliance, hardening it from a fragile pact into a shared, unyielding purpose. With Jedediah's dynamite carefully packed away, they left the river behind, venturing deeper into the mountains, now fugitives hunted by two different kinds of predators. 2 days later, as they were navigating a thickly wooded canyon, a scream echoed from the rocks above, a sound of pure terror, followed by the vicious snarl of a great cat. Caleb was already climbing, his rifle in hand. Ellie scrambled after him and saw the scene in a small clearing. A young Apache woman, her leg twisted and caught in a fissure between two boulders, was fending off a mountain lion with a broken branch. The cat, a fluid shadow of muscle and fang, was circling, readying for a final lunge. Caleb didn't aim to kill. He fired a single shot into the rock just above the cougar's head. The deafening crack of the rifle and the spray of stone chips sent the startled animal bounding away into the forest. The young woman looked at them, her dark eyes wide with fear and suspicion. Caleb used his immense strength to shift the boulder, freeing her trapped leg. As Ellie knelt to examine the injury, she saw this woman was different from Iron Vulture's warriors. Her buckskin was adorned with intricate blue beadwork, not war paint, and her expression, though wary, held an intelligent curiosity. As Ellie cleaned and bandaged the wound, the woman's suspicion slowly softened into a cautious trust. And her name was Morning Star. She explained that she was the daughter of Chief Conlon, the leader of the White River Apaches. "Iron Vulture does not speak for our people," she said, her English clear and thoughtful. "He was cast out. He follows a new, violent path, fueled by the lies of the man you call Blackwood." She confirmed everything Jedediah had suspected, that Blackwood was supplying the renegades with weapons and whispering poison in Iron Vulture's ear, convincing him that Ellie's map was a key to defiling their most sacred place, the Spirit Canyon. Before she departed, Morning Star reached into a pouch at her belt and produced a single eagle feather, its base wrapped in blue and white beads. "My father is a man of peace," she said, pressing it into Ellie's hand. "But Iron Vulture's actions have made him wary of all outsiders. If you see my father, show him this. It will not grant you safe passage, but it will grant you a moment to speak. Let him know you come with a true heart. She gave Caleb a nod of profound gratitude, then turned and vanished into the trees as silently as a deer. The small feather felt impossibly heavy in Ellie's hand, a fragile token of peace in a land consumed by war. Hope was a dangerous currency in the Dragoon Mountains, and they had spent their last coin. After 2 more days of careful, silent travel, they finally reached their destination, a deep, narrow ravine cutting through a high mountain pass. Far below, wedged between 2 boulders, was the dark, oblong shape of the map chest. A grim sense of purpose settled over them. They were close, but the silence was wrong. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, the kind that precedes a lightning strike. Caleb sensed it first. He stopped dead, his head raised, sniffing the wind. His eyes narrowed to slits, scanned the high canyon walls that loomed over them on both sides. "It's a trap," he growled, his voice a low vibration of warning. He pointed with his chin. Up there, sunlight on a rifle barrel. Ellie followed his gaze and saw it, a tiny, blinding flash of light from the ridge ahead. At the same moment, a single hawk feather, an Apache signal, drifted down from the ridge behind them. They had walked into a box canyon, a stone throat designed for an ambush. As if on cue, figures materialized on the cliffs. Ahead of them, blocking the path to the ravine, stood Iron Vulture and 5 of his warriors. They rose from the rocks like spirits of vengeance, their faces streaked with black and red war paint, bows drawn. Then, a voice echoed from behind them, cutting off their only retreat. "Nowhere left to run, Bear." On the ridge they had just crossed, Silas Blackwood's hired guns appeared, a half-dozen rough-looking men leveling their Winchesters. They were caught in a perfect pincer, trapped in a killing field no wider than a city street. There was no cover, no escape. The sheer rock walls offered no handholds. They were exposed, outnumbered, and outgunned. Blackwood's men wanted the map. Iron Vulture wanted them dead for daring to seek it. The air grew thick, the tension coiling into an unbearable knot. Ellie drew her revolver, her hand steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. She stood back to back with Caleb, 2 small, defiant figures against a tide of imminent violence. This was the end of the line. In that desperate moment, Caleb looked at her. His face was a mask of cold fury, but his eyes held something she had never seen before. Not the haunted emptiness of his grief, but a clear, blazing fire of absolute resolve. He saw not just a woman from Boston, but a promise he had to keep. "I couldn't save my family," he said, his voice low and steady, meant for her ears only. "I will not fail again." The battle for a dead man's map was about to begin, but for the giant cowboy at her side, it was a battle for his very soul. The standoff shattered with the crack of a rifle. A bullet from Blackwood's men ricocheted off the rock near Ellie's head, and the pass erupted into a chaotic crossfire. Caleb threw himself in front of her, shoving her behind a small cluster of boulders that offered meager cover. "There's no fighting our way out of this," he yelled over the din of gunfire. His eyes were blazing with a desperate, terrible clarity. He ripped open his satchel and pulled out the oilskin package Jedediah had given them. Dynamite. "This is our only chance." He worked quickly, his hands sure and steady as he cut a short length of fuse. "I'm going to bring the mountain down on them," he said, his voice grim. "It'll seal the pass behind us, cause enough confusion for you to get to the chest." Ellie's eyes widened in horror. "Us? Caleb, that's suicide." He ignored her, his focus absolute. "When you hear the blast, you don't hesitate. You don't look back. You get that chest, and you climb. Use the rocks for cover. Follow the water down." "Caleb, no!" she cried, grabbing his arm. He stopped and looked at her, his expression softening for just a fraction of a second. He reached up and pulled a thin leather thong from around his neck. On it hung a single, simple gold band, worn smooth with time. "Sarah's," he said, his voice thick with a universe of unspoken memories. He pressed the ring into her palm, his large hand closing hers around it. It was still warm from his skin. "Keep this for me." Before she could protest further, he lit the fuse. It sputtered to life, a tiny, deadly snake of sparks. "Go," he roared, but he didn't run for cover. He ran out into the open, a giant, defiant target, firing his rifle at Blackwood's men to draw their attention. He sprinted towards the sheer cliff face on Iron Vulture's side of the pass, wedging the hissing dynamite deep into a crevice. Ellie scrambled towards the ravine, her mind screaming. The world detonated. A blinding flash was followed by a roar that shook the very foundations of the earth. She was thrown from her feet as the mountain itself seemed to scream in protest. A tidal wave of rock, stone, and dust sheared off the cliff face, crashing down into the pass with the force of 1,000 freight trains, sealing the path of retreat. Through the thick, swirling dust, Ellie pushed herself up and looked back. She saw chaos, and she saw Caleb. He was on his knees, his rifle gone. The surviving Apache warriors were swarming him. She saw a rifle butt rise and fall. Caleb slumped forward, a fallen giant, and was swallowed by the dust and the press of bodies. A scream, silent and agonizing, tore through her. He had kept his promise, and in doing so, he had left her more alone than ever before. Grief was a fire. It burned away the pain in her shoulder, the exhaustion in her limbs, the terror in her heart. All that was left was a white-hot, singular focus. Get the chest. Keep the promise. Fueled by the image of Caleb falling, Ellie scrambled towards the ravine. The explosion had loosened the rock face, making the descent a treacherous, desperate scramble. Her fingers, raw and bleeding, found purchase in cracks Caleb had taught her to spot. Her knowledge of geology, of strata and fault lines, became a tool of survival. She reached the bottom, found the heavy chest wedged tight, and used a crowbar from her pack to pry it free. The climb back up was a nightmare of burning muscles and sobbing breaths, but the weight of the chest was nothing compared to the weight of the ring on her hand. When she finally collapsed at the top, she had a choice. She could try to flee, to find her way back to some semblance of civilization. Or she could follow the last, most cryptic section of her father's map, a route marked Via Tenebrosa, the Dark Way. It led deeper into Apache territory. It led towards the Spirit Canyon. Looking at the wall of rock and dust that had claimed Caleb, she knew there was no going back. Following her father's notes, she found it behind a curtain of dried vines, a narrow opening in the rock, an entrance to a cave system. The air that flowed out was cool and still, holding the silence of centuries. Lighting her lantern, she stepped out of the brutal sunlight and into the heart of the mountain. The tunnels were a labyrinth, but her father's chart was unerring. For hours she walked through the profound quiet, her only companion the echo of her own footsteps. Then her lantern light fell upon the walls, and she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The walls were covered in ancient pictographs painted in ochre and charcoal. Faded figures hunted spirit deer. Shamans danced under painted constellations. And then she saw it, a repeating series of images that made her heart stop. It showed a mountain shaped like a human heart, with pure water flowing from its center. Below it were drawings of her father's geological symbols, notations for aquifers, for porous limestone, for the water table. The shock of understanding was a physical blow. The Apaches' Spirit Canyon, their most sacred place, and her father's primary aquifer, they were the same. He hadn't been charting a resource to be exploited. He had been scientifically proving the existence of a place the Apaches already knew was sacred. The map wasn't a weapon. It was a bridge between two worlds. She looked at the worn gold ring on her hand, then at the map in her pack. She was no longer just the keeper of a map. She was the guardian of a legacy, her father's, Caleb's, and the land's itself. The secret path opened up behind a waterfall, and Ellie stepped out of the cool darkness into a place of impossible beauty. The Spirit Canyon was a hidden world, a deep basin filled with lush greenery, hanging gardens of maidenhair fern, and pools of water so clear they seemed like panes of blue glass. It was the heart of the mountain, a natural cathedral, and for a moment Ellie was overwhelmed by its sacred peace. The peace was shattered by the cold, familiar voice of her nemesis. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Silas Blackwood said. "Water is more precious than silver, Miss Vance, and I intend to have both." He was standing by the largest pool, flanked by 4 of his most ruthless-looking gunmen. He hadn't been waiting. He had been excavating. At the far end of the canyon, the beginnings of a mine shaft scarred the pristine rock face. "Your father was a brilliant man," Blackwood continued with a predatory smile. "A bit sentimental for my taste, but brilliant. I'm grateful to you for finishing his work." He gestured with his pistol. "The chest." "Now." Before Ellie could respond, another voice, sharp and filled with hate, echoed from the cliffs above. "Blackwood." Iron Vulture and his warriors appeared on the canyon rim, their arrows trained on the scene below. "The map belongs to the people." The 3 factions were locked in a deadly triangle, the air vibrating with imminent violence. Blackwood simply laughed, supremely confident. "You see, Miss Vance, savages squabbling over trinkets. This is a world for men of vision." This was her moment. "He's lying to you, Iron Vulture." Ellie's voice, clear and strong, rang through the canyon. She pulled her father's geological charts from the chest. "This isn't just a map to a canyon. It's a map of the water under the canyon, the lifeblood of this entire mountain." She held up a cross-section diagram. "Blackwood's mine will poison this water. His pumps will drain it dry within a year to wash his silver ore. He isn't here to trespass on your sacred ground. He's here to kill it." "She lies," Blackwood snarled, but Iron Vulture was listening, his fanatical eyes filled with a dawning, terrible understanding. At that critical moment, a new group of warriors appeared at the canyon entrance, moving with quiet authority. At their head was an older, dignified chief, and beside him was Morning Star. She had seen the peace feather Ellie had left at the cave entrance. "Father," Morning Star said, her voice carrying the weight of truth, "the woman does not lie." The chief, Conlon, looked at Iron Vulture with sorrowful eyes, then at Blackwood, with a gaze as hard as flint. The betrayal was complete. With a scream of pure rage, Iron Vulture raised his bow, but he did not aim at Ellie. He aimed at Blackwood. The canyon exploded into chaos as the renegades attacked the gunmen. In the ensuing firefight, Ellie saw Blackwood scrambling for the dark opening of his mineshaft, a snake retreating to its hole. She pulled the last stick of Jedediah's dynamite from her pack, lit the fuse, and threw it, not at Blackwood, but at the unstable rock arch above the tunnel entrance. The explosion was deafening. The entire archway collapsed, sealing the mine with 1,000,000 tons of rock and burying Silas Blackwood alive in his own monument to greed. As the dust settled, the fighting stopped. Iron Vulture, wounded, looked at Ellie with a new, grudging respect. Justice, swift and absolute, had been delivered. In the echoing silence that followed the explosion, the fight was over. Iron Vulture, clutching a wounded arm, stood before Chief Conlon, his head bowed not in defeat, but in a long overdue deference. Justice, swift and final, had been rendered by the mountain itself. Ellie walked forward, the heavy map chest in her hands. She placed it on the ground before the old chief, a humble offering. "This belongs to the mountain," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And to its true guardians." Chief Conlon looked at her, his ancient eyes holding a deep, profound wisdom. "You have honored the spirits of this place, Eleanor Vance," he said, "and in doing so, you have honored us all." The victory felt hollow, the beauty of the canyon tainted by the ghost of the man who had made it possible. As Ellie stood alone, the full weight of her loss crashing down on her, Morning Star came to her side. She didn't speak. She simply touched Ellie's arm and led her away from the center of the canyon, towards a small, secluded wickiup nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees. The air smelled of sage and willow bark. Morningstar pulled back the flap, and Ellie looked inside. A figure lay on a bed of soft furs, his massive chest wrapped in clean bandages. He was pale, battered, and breathing shallowly, but he was alive. It was Caleb. Conlan's warriors had found him at the edge of the rockslide, buried and broken, but with a flicker of life still in him. Ellie fell to her knees beside him, her hands covering her mouth to stifle a sob of disbelief and overwhelming relief. His eyes fluttered open, finding hers through a haze of pain. "Caleb," was all she could whisper. A faint smile touched his chapped lips. He saw the gold band on her hand. "You kept your promise," he rasped. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched his hand. "You kept yours," she answered. "You came back to me." 3 months later, the sun rose over a different kind of world. The map, once a symbol of conflict, was now a blueprint for peace. At a great council, Chief Conlan and the leaders of the nearby settlements, with Ellie as the chief arbiter, had forged a historic agreement to build a shared reservoir, ensuring water for all. The ghost of Silas Blackwood was gone, and in its place, something new and fragile began to grow. On a small plot of land overlooking the river where they had buried Jedediah, a new cabin stood. On its porch, Ellie and Caleb watched the dawn paint the sky. His arm was still in a sling, and he would carry the scars of his last battle forever, but the haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady peace. He was no longer the ghost of the mountain. He was simply Caleb. The simple gold band was no longer a keepsake, but a proper wedding ring on Ellie's finger. He took her hand, his touch gentle. "Look at that sunrise," he said, his voice full of a quiet wonder he thought he had lost forever. "It's a new day, Ellie." And as she leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid, living warmth of him, she knew he was right. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, but they had found their way home. Ellie and Caleb found their sunrise, a new beginning, earned through fire, sacrifice, and a love that refused to die. Their long journey is over, but ours is just beginning. My question for you tonight is simple. In that desperate moment in the Devil's Pass, when Caleb made his choice to save her, did you feel it in your heart? If you did, please take a moment and just leave a single number 1 in the comments below. You don't have to say anything else. It's just a quiet way of letting us know that these stories of courage and sacrifice still matter. Thank you for walking this trail with us. There are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. To make sure you're with us for the next journey into the heart of the West, please subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you again, right here, for another tale.